Welcome. Welcome to our C-SPAN and Grand Rapids audience, and a shout out to the Hauensteins and to the Whites who are here in attendance this afternoon. I'm Gleaves Whitney, the host of today's discussion, and since 2003, the director of the Hauenstein Center for Presidential Studies, which of course is named after Colonel Ralph W. Hauenstein, whom we're going to be speaking of. I'm joined on stage by two individuals for whom World War II is no textbook abstraction. To your right is Pia Kurusu White, daughter of the late Ambassador Saburo Kurusu. Pia's father is remembered now as the envoy who tried to negotiate peace and further goodwill with America, while the Japanese military under Tojo was secretly preparing to attack Pearl Harbor. Pia is the youngest of Ambassador Kurusu's 3 children. Her mother was American from New York City. After World War II, Pia married an American, worked in commercial real estate, and lived much of her adult life in the Grand Rapids area. One of her great-grandchildren, Garrett, is in the audience and is a candidate in the Hauenstein Center's Cook Leadership Academy. To your far right is Brian Hauenstein, youngest grandson of Colonel Ralph W. Hauenstein. Brian's grandfather is best known as General Eisenhower's Chief of Intelligence in World War II. In his hunt for Nazis, during that war, he was the first U.S. Army officer into liberated Paris, into the Dachau death camp, and into places of just unbelievable horror. After the war, Ralph discovered his vocation as an entrepreneur, and he is remembered as the father of goldfish crackers. Throughout his career in the private sector, he also became one of West Michigan's lead philanthropists. And I'm going to say later, and Brian will too, it's more than just the fact that his name is on buildings, a lot more. His grandson Brian has spent most of his adult life in West Michigan. He works with Oasis Senior Advisors, where he is the organization's senior advisor, and he serves on the Hauenstein Center's cabinet. Now, Brian's daughter, Lilia, is also in the audience, and she's a recent graduate of our Cook Leadership Academy at the Hauenstein Center, and she's soon going to be taking a job in Tokyo. Congratulations, by the way, Lilia. On a personal note, 2 things. One of the highlights of my time at the Hauenstein Center was when I had the opportunity to introduce Ralph and Pia to each other over lunch and to listen to them share stories of their very different wartime perspectives. 2 people who in a previous era might have regarded themselves as enemies, but now met as friends. It was a beautiful event. And finally, I want to say that in life, we often seek one thing, but we find another. To me, Ralph became much more than the center's figurehead. In the 12 years that I knew Ralph, he was a wise advisor, a faithful mentor, and he was just a terrific and a treasured friend. We met for lunch every Wednesday here in town, and we met on Saturday mornings as well over a cup of coffee. It's where he told me his stories. And I not only learned history, the kind of history you don't get in textbooks, not only laughed at his arch sense of humor, not only experienced his gift of friendship, but also by his example understood what it is to become a better man. So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Pia White and Brian Hauenstein. Well, to begin our conversation, I think we should get to know your people a little bit better. I think if we could take 4 or 5 minutes each. Pia, why don't you begin? Tell us what you think we ought to know about your father, famous ambassador.
Well, he was primarily known, I think, for the person who signed the Tripartite Pact, which was not a very good idea, according to my father, but he was a ranking Japanese ambassador in Europe, and so although he had no part in negotiating the pact, was ordered to sign the agreement. As the architect on the Japanese side of the pact was unable to come to Europe, they didn't have the flights they do now. He wasn't able to attend it. in person, so my dad was appointed to perform that task. Unfortunately, he didn't really care, and he more or less signed it under duress. The other thing that he was possibly known for was he was a special envoy sent to Washington to attempt to negotiate some sort of a peace, avoiding the World War II. Unfortunately, it didn't turn out to be successful, and he regarded it as the worst part of his career because it ended then and he wasn't successful in attaining his goal. And as a result, the war came and he lost his only son in the war.
Thank you for that introduction. Brian, please tell us a little bit more about Colonel Ralph W. Hauenstein.
Most notably, he was Eisenhower's chief of intelligence, but leading up to that, he was, for a period of time, a couple of years, in Iceland. And backing up, I suppose, even a bit further than that, he was editor of the Grand Rapids Herald, and that sort of led his path. He was he was a lieutenant in the CCCs, the Civil Conservation Corps, ahead of that. And of course, so all of this expertise in being a reporter and military experience, all of those things sort of culminated into the perfect person to really work in an intelligence division. So when he was in Iceland, he was assigned to the intelligence division. Of course, he was aide-de-camp to General Bonesteel. But while he was there, most people don't know this, but we were already sort of actively engaging with the Germans. They were sinking some merchant ships. We were shooting down planes. And of course, it was one of those planes that they had shot down that they noticed a code book was amidst the wreckage. And I think there might be an image of that here. If not, he took that code book to Bletchley Park. And many know that the story of Bletchley Park where they were encoding the German Enigma. And so some school of thought is that code breaking was in part took place because of that book that was recovered during that time. But he, of course, as Gleaves had mentioned, he was in such turning points of the war throughout. One story, he arrived into Paris, and of course, he was the first to arrive. And as he's coming into town, they had landed on the outskirts of town. He's coming into town, and all of a sudden, boom, bomb goes off, and he's thinking he's under attack. Well, it was actually the vehicle he was in backfired, and, so he was okay. So there's so many great stories to tell about the war, and I could really just go on forever, but I think maybe I'll save for some of the after-war experiences as well for a little bit further.
Okay, thank you, Brian. Well, both of your relatives who were involved in the war had a distinguished career in public service. And it's interesting how they got to public service because it wasn't a linear, obvious path. And I think for the young people present, it would be interesting for them to hear how Saburo, for example, ended up in the diplomatic corps when no one expected in his family for him to do that. Pia, could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes. His father owned a shipbuilding company and apparently did some business with people from overseas. And I don't know that was a fact, but I suspect that might have been a factor in my father developing an interest in the rest of the world. And immediately, he apparently had made up his mind to enter the diplomatic service because immediately after graduation from university, he entered the Japanese Foreign Service. And he, of course, as a result, we were dragged, the whole family, all over the world. And at times that, especially when I got to my teenage years, I used to tell my mother, when I grow up, I'm going to stay in one place. I'm not. But it was an interesting experience that in retrospect, I would not have missed it for anything.
It provided your family with just these amazing experiences to
Yes.
travel and see so much of the world.
It was difficult at times because my mother believed in if you wanted a child to learn to swim, you put them in the water. And when they went under, it was time enough to do something. And so whatever country we arrived in, the first thing that was done was to put me in the local school without knowing a word of the language that was spoken there. But oddly enough, as a child, I was able to pick up rather quickly, and so I didn't have to look at children looking at me and saying things that I knew were bad things about me.
Well, thank you. Brian, tell us how Ralph got to public service, this distinguished military career. It wasn't obvious when he started out.
No, I think that, he was, first of all, I should say that he was very much a religious man. And so, I think that his path was sort of guided through his faith belief, right? And when he, back in between the wars, the Great Wars, World War I and II, he was smart enough to see that, we were not going to get out of this next round, right? And so I think that from a very early age, and I suppose he was in his early 20s at that time, he realized that, for the betterment of our country and the betterment of himself, really, in some ways it sort of protected him because he went in as an officer versus an enlisted man, right? But there were opportunities that presented themselves, but he was also, he sort of pushed things along as well. So he didn't just kind of let things happen. And of course, public service after the war, the opportunity came to serve on Eisenhower's, committees and so forth. He was in the inner circle of Washington. He took advantage of all those opportunities. Jamestown Foundation served there for a number of years, ensuring that our country would be safe from communism. And I know, because he was appointed to that position in somewhere around 61, I believe it was, all the way through, and of course, most notably, the first free Russian elections, there he was with Gorbachev and guys like Wolseley, chief intelligence, and alike. So, his whole life was just dedicated really to country and to family and to building business, right? I mean, and all that sort of tied together nicely for him. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I think both of these individuals had a real sense of what a nation needed. You can't have everybody always in the private sector and just doing their own thing. They knew the sacrifices that public service entailed. And both of them were imbued with that intelligence and that grace, I would say, to be able to do that. Okay, now, Pia, I think you just teased us a little bit. You're telling us a little bit what it was like to be a child of this famous diplomat, somebody who would become a world figure. Tell us more about what it's like to be the child of somebody who's that high profile and is right in the middle of so much that's happening in the world.
Well, I think one thing was rather a burden because from the very early age, somehow I knew that my behavior would have consequences, not just for my family, but possibly even, heaven forbid, for the country. So, but, it was something that you either adjusted to all the movement and the change of countries, or you just had to drown. So, fortunately, due to my mother's attitude towards things, that you just If you can't change it, Pia, you roll with it. It was the other thing that, as I became older and was aware of things that were going on in the world, it became fascinating to be allowed many times to listen to what my father recounted as a result of something that happened. And for instance, to illustrate basically what a diplomat's job was, when I was 3 years old, my father was posted to Lima, Peru. And it was a period when many Okinawa citizens immigrated to Peru, and it was creating an issue, economic stresses, and the fact that there were so many who entered so quickly, short period of time. And so it was my father's job as a Japanese diplomat in the country to find a solution to disperse this issue that had arisen. So he was able to negotiate with the Peruvian government to have them made available, sparsely populated section of Peru, since many of these Okinawan people were farmers, to relocate them to that land. And this issues just simply dispersed because farmers, the Okinawans, were doing what they were trained to do, and there was no longer an economic issue in the city. But those are the kind of things that at the time I didn't realize. I was only 3 years old. But in learning and listening to my father speak or my family discuss, I became very aware of the fact that a diplomat's job was not an easy one, but a great opportunity to do good to wherever they were posted.
And just a little follow-up, did you feel that you were sort of watched? I mean, your behavior, you were constantly...
Yes, I don't recall that anybody ever told me that, but I definitely had a feeling that my behavior, especially in public, was rather important that it be a good one.
Yes. Well, Brian, what's so interesting about Ralph is that he did not reveal all that he had done in World War II. So
That's right.
when you're his grandchild and you're growing up around him, maybe you hear some stories, but it's only, I think, in the latter part of the 1990s that he starts to reveal who he was. And you mentioned the code book earlier. Let's put it out on the table right now. Ralph probably saved tens, if not hundreds of thousands of lives by being one of the first to discover that code book and get it to the British so that the code breakers could start working on it. And Churchill would end up saying, that no one could know that we've broken that code. Truth is too precious not to be surrounded by a bodyguard of lies. That was the saying that Ralph would tell us, you and me, and the family. So you find out as an adult, really, who he is.
Well,
Tell us what that was like.
It was interesting because we all, family here, we all knew that he was in the military and we knew that he fought in World War II and we knew his rank and things like that, but we really didn't understand to what extent he really contributed. And I think for me it was 1985, and that was the celebration of D-Day Invasion 50, right? 50 years past D-Day. Is that right? Am I doing the math right? I am. 40. I'm not doing the math right. I'm not a banker anymore. And I think it was because Washington had allowed this thing to happen, to talk about the Enigma machine and the coding and so forth. And so he started doing some public talking at the Ford Museum. He did a bit, and there was a piece in the paper on it. And so then we started to ask a lot more questions, and of course he was always, because he operated most of his life in the shadows, he wasn't very forthcoming with many of the answers that we we were looking for, right? But we would still hear, stories over the dinner table. I was telling somebody earlier today I'm using chopsticks, and the first time my brother and I were using chopsticks at his house, he says, "Oh yeah, I learned how to use chopsticks in Paris when I had dinner with Shanghai Shek." And I thought, well, does every military person eat with Shanghai Shek? I don't know. The other one was corn on the cob one day. We had corn on the cob at the house. And he says, I taught General Molotov how to eat corn on the cob. Okay. Does everybody do that? I don't know.
The Molotov cocktail.
Right, yeah, well, I don't think those are tied together, but... But so it was fascinating to, as he aged, just hear these stories. And of course, many I think in the room have heard many of these great stories as well, but certainly not those on C-SPAN. He was also, it's worth noting that he was called up by the Vatican to be a Vatican observer, Vatican II, and was deeply involved with the Catholic Church. I don't know how many popes that he spent a little private time with, but he was very passionate about his faith, and as was Grace, his wife.
Well, one of the tricks I learned, and I think anybody who knew Ralph learned this trick, if you really wanted him to open up and start talking about his experiences, give him a glass of Finlandia. And then the second Finlandia, he really is ready to start telling the stories. Oh, he was great in that way. He would open up, and that's where we, I'm sure, heard the best stories.
Yeah.
Well, let me ask a little bit of a different question. You grew up in an environment where Japan was changing a lot, and you would go to Western Europe or South America, you had different experience of different kinds of regimes.
Yeah.
And I'm sure, Pia, that made you think a lot about what it's like to grow up in freedom and have an environment in which you're pretty much able to do what you can. Tell us about your experience, though, when you went back to Japan after it had begun to change under
Yes.
Tojo.
We'd spent 3 years in Europe. We left Japan in 1936 and returned in 1939. And before we left for Europe, Japan seemed to be a fairly free and normal country. And when we returned in 1939, such a dramatic change had taken place in the culture. I remember that apparently fraternization between the sexes was very discouraged for some reason, I know not why. But I had a cousin, a boy, who was same age as I was, and we went to the same school. And we had to go, there was a section in Tokyo where there was one bookstore after another. They had different specialties, some of them specialized in certain countries' literature and so on. Anyway, we needed to go to some bookstore to acquire a text for school. And we passed by the bookstore that specialized in Russian literature. So I said to my cousin, I want to go in there. And he said, no, we don't want to spend the time. Let's go look for what we need to look. He started to walk away. So I chased after him and grabbed him, trying to get him to go in this Russian literature store. Well, there was a police kiosk nearby. And the policeman came out and politely asked us to come into the kiosk. And I thought, oh dear, that's all I need. My parents are going to read the paper and see that their daughter was accused of being unethical. And my cousin, fortunately, was a fast-thinking fellow. And he said, oh, we're terribly sorry, but this girl is a student from the Philippines. And she's been here a short time, so she's not aware of the rules. And I really didn't want to bring her down, but my mother insisted that I bring her down to get this book that was necessary for her schooling. And that was a great thing to happen to me, because anytime I got into trouble, I became a Philippine exchange student. And that took care of a lot of awkward circumstances. The other thing that was sort of interesting, I guess all leaders have things they like to do that they feel connects them to the people. General Tojo was then the Prime Minister of Japan. And of course, he's the one who developed this very militaristic regime. And his thing was to ride his horse every morning in various neighborhoods. And if there were people there he could speak to, he would stop and speak. And of course, there was a whole bunch of media people following him. And I was waiting for my bus to go to school one morning when I heard this clop, 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 and I looked and I thought, oh dear, this will not bode well. And so I quickly I was sitting on the curb actually, waiting for my bus, and I quickly got up and ran into the front yard of a house nearby so that I wouldn't have to be interviewed by Mr. Tojo. But that was how, in the short 3 years that we were away, the total atmosphere and culture of the country had changed. I found that rather amazing that it could happen in such a short period of time.
And Ralph, of course, referred to himself, as a kid from the Midwest, the Prohibition Midwest when he was really young. And all of a sudden he's called to Iceland and then Europe, and he sees the contrasts between what's happening, in the United States and in the Midwest, which had been isolationist, and now he's confronted with tyranny and fortress Europe, and it changes him, and it broadens his outlook. Brian, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Well, certainly. You can just imagine, as you say, West Michigan really native. He was born in Fort Wayne, Indiana, but at a very young age moved to Grand Rapids. And so he was really, his roots were Grand Rapids and very Midwestern. And to see what he saw with his own eyes and to experience that must have just been a tremendous undertaking. He talked about, and you mentioned earlier, Dachau concentration camp, and the experience that he had there with the prisoners. You can imagine, he's on the hunt for Hitler. He's just been to Eagle's Nest. He's headed towards Berlin, and of course, being an intelligence officer, you got some reports from the field that these sorts of things were going on, but there was never any really concrete evidence of it. And so when he saw this firsthand, and of course the prisoners come up to him, and he still had a scar on his hand up until the day he died, that somebody squeezed him so hard, they were so happy that they were there. And to see the stacks of bodies and just the horrific things that he did. He interrogated the camp commander of Dachau, and as you said, yesterday, his sergeant next to him had all he could do to restrain him from doing the wrong thing, and he realized that later to shoot this guy on the spot. But it was just an awful experience.
All right. Well, that does lead to segues into the next question I did want to ask. I mean, both. So your father, your grandfather, were really sensitive souls in a lot of ways. And for example, your father spent time in his youth in a Zen temple, yes, studying, and a very spiritual man in addition to, having a very, very sensitive soul. And how did he deal with so many of the difficult things that came up in World War II, the atrocities, the war crimes?
He was very saddened because I remember he was telling us a story that his first post was in Hangzhou, China, which was a major Chinese port. And it was a period when many navies traveled around the world, and Hangzhou was one of the major stops. And therefore, many countries had consuls that represented their interests. And my father said he was envied by all the rest of the consulates there because the Japanese fleet would come in and the sailors would tie their lunch around their middle and go sightseeing, go back to the ship. And when the ships left, he had no problems whatsoever. Where many of the other consuls complained that when their fleet left, they left behind so many issues and complaints by the Chinese government of misbehaviors by the sailors. And my father could not understand how the culture could have changed to the point where Japanese soldiers were no longer adhering to the warrior,
Yes.
that was
Code.
regulated the samurais. They were very strict culture of behavior by warriors. And that was prevalent, but evidently by the time World War II occurred, that had totally disintegrated. And my father was so saddened to think that members of his country, a country he represented for so many years, were capable of doing such awful things, creating atrocities.
What is, of all the stories that you heard Ralph tell you, and I'll be asking you the same thing, Pia, what's your favorite story that Ralph told you?
Oh, we may have to come back. We may have to start with Pia. I can't think of my favorite. There's so many good ones. Gosh. You should have told me this beforehand, Cleves.
Well, he had some great stories, for example, of his time in Paris when he had just a, he was trying to organize. First of all, he was given a tour of the Gestapo headquarters, so he saw the headquarters of pure evil, and that seared him when he saw interrogation rooms and found out what really happened in there. He also learned, for example, to love the opera. Again, this kid from the Midwest, he talked about how much it meant to him to go to the opera, and there was one opera in particular that was his favorite, Brian. Remember the story of La Boheme?
Yeah.
And the reason it meant so much to him, here he was introduced to this opera by a man named Puccini. And La Boheme is about an artist who's in the garret, in the attic of a very cold apartment in Paris. And Ralph is in Paris at a time in the winter when there was not enough fuel for people to heat their homes. And they were sacrificing. And he tells the story of one Sunday going up to Montmartre, or to Mass. He was driven up there. And what struck him when he got out of the car, and he's on the hill there with the cathedral, and he's looking down over the terrain, the landscape with Paris all around him, and there's no smoke. No one could use the fuel to warm their homes. And he understood that they were cold. And then all of a sudden he connected that with going to the opera and seeing, this poor young Parisian who was freezing in her attic. And he felt such compassion. I'll tell you this, I only saw Ralph come to tears a couple of times in all of the stories that he told me. And one of them was when he was talking about the heroism of the Parisians and their sense of sacrifice that was necessary to endure that part of the war, knowing that they were cold and suffering.
Tied to that story, so 5 years ago, my daughter and I went to Paris, and we were up near Montmartre. And he, of course, he had never really adopted technology fully. He tried, but like many seniors are just, I'm not going to learn a darn new thing, you know. And he was staying with my parents at the time, and so we FaceTimed him. And I'll never forget that, because we were we were looking over the city, and of course, you know, he hadn't been there for many, many years, but you could see him reminiscing in his own mind about what he saw, and he was talking about how he saw, you know, people eating out of garbage cans and just the, you know, the poverty that was right in front of him there. So
The story about people eating out of the garbage, what struck me about one of those stories was he was describing a man who was dressed very nattily. I mean, somebody who just as like a tuxedo to us. And the dignity that was injured, that man's dignity, that he had to go through the trash to eat. Ralph was so struck by that he tried to maintain his dignity with this very formal suit. It's crazy things for a kid from the Midwest.
right.
So what about you, Pia? What's your favorite story that you really love to hear your father tell?
Well, actually, it's something that he did,
Okay.
which illustrated to us what a soft soul he was. We were in Belgium, and the war was imminent, and so the Belgian army was reactivated and apparently dispersed to various sections of Belgium. And so these trucks and tanks, all kinds of vehicles, as well as soldiers, were going by where our house happened to be. And we had a dog named Jimmy, who was a wire-hair terrier. And Jimmy evidently was entranced by all this activity in the street in front of us, so he jumped the little garden door and disappeared. We never found out what happened to him, but we had an idea that some soldier probably picked Jimmy up, and Jimmy was very happy to be with. Well, my father didn't usually, to our knowledge, take walks in the evening. But as soon as Jimmy disappeared, Jimmy was primarily his dog. He would announce after dinner that he was going to take a little walk. And he would leave the house, and a few minutes later we would hear him call, "Jimmy, Jimmy," because Jimmy never appeared. But that sort of, to me, illustrated the kind of a kind person that he was.
Yes. Well, all dog lovers are kind souls,
Yes,
right?
that's right, absolutely.
I think we also ought to hear about the spouses. I mean, remarkable people in and of themselves. Alice, you know, and you know, your mother's case, and Grace and your grandmother's case. Please tell us about what these spouses. Would you like to talk about Grace?
Yeah. My grandmother was born and raised in Paris, not Paris, France, Paris, Michigan, just north of Big Rapids, Irish Catholic family. She had several nuns in her family, but she was an extremely strong, faithful person. I learned probably more about her, and to some degree, at least during the war years, reading some of her letters this last week. And I think there might have been a portion of one up there. My grandfather made me agree with him that I would not share her letters and his exchange letters, but I think that small caption is okay. He's not striking me down anyway. So, but they were just an extremely passionate couple, and you can kind of see that here in this letter. But
Brian, in your pause, I've got to say that this passage that you selected, I got a lump in my throat.
Right.
When I read that when you
and
said
there's
that
so
to
many.
me.
There really are so many like this in those letters. I mean, he was a writer, right? I mean, he was a newspaper guy, but he had a way with words.
Would you like to read it out loud?
Oh, sure.
It's a beautiful letter.
I do realize, darling, your great need for the as appointed out. I'm sorry, it's hard to read this a little bit here. I realize, darling, your great need for me as pointed out in your last letter, and only pray that this thing will soon be over forever. Be forever chance of being, I'm sorry. It's hard to follow. It's up there. Yeah, it's probably easier for you to read it. The way it's angled here, sorry.
Can you all in the back read this? Okay, good.
And it's a typewriter, right? So the words are kind of jumbled together a little bit here, but it's very moving.
I mean, I think this one passage about where he says, "The children miss me and I miss them ever so much, often dreaming by the hour of how I can improve as a father and companion to them. Perhaps we'll all be richer by this separation. For surely I love you and them to so great an end, and realize and feel your devoted love towards me." I mean, does that not just get your heart?
Yeah. And repeatedly he would talk about being with the children and ice skating and doing all these things as a family. It was so important to him. And of course, he came back after the war, and I was having a conversation with my dad about this last weekend, just to make sure we're on the same page, right? But we all saw this growing up. As a grandfather, he was so passionate about getting the family together. If we were in, the month of February and he hadn't heard about, what are the plans for St. Patrick's Day and the 3 birthdays that are going to happen, what's going on? I want to know. We have to have a plan. So he was very loving in that way, and very, much ever present in the moment. He wasn't a guy that was going to be on the phone, even though his business may have required it. He was right there with you. And I think, many in the community, I've heard from many of you. Hillary, I think I saw Hillary Snell in here. He shared a story with me as he was passing through the Pantlan Hotel one day, and he knew of my grandfather and some of his stories, and he said, "Hey, Ralph, you don't know me, but I'd just love to have lunch with you." And he said, "By all means." That's the kind of guy he was, and he'd love to share his stories, what he could of them, and he loved his community. And I think you can see that, throughout Grand Rapids. It's the many things that you don't see that he did that are really special to me.
If I remember, your grandfather told me that he was away for 5 years without seeing his family. And I wondered how hard that must have been, not just for him, but his family as well.
Yeah, well, he repeatedly wrote, and of course I went through a lot of these letters the last few days. He repeatedly wrote, "I hope I'll be home soon," and I think that's what kept him going. He didn't know what the end of the war was going to look like. He didn't know if it was going to be tomorrow or if it was going to be a year from now. So, he wrote letters twice a week. He said, I'm going to make sure I'm going to write to you twice a week, and I think my grandmother probably wrote every day. There were a lot of letters. But that was the FaceTime or Facebook of the time, right?
Brian, tell us about this particular photograph.
So he had this, I think, almost probably my dad could probably tell you better because he's in the photo, but I think he had come back. This was when he was stationed in Iceland. He had come back to give a debriefing to the president at the time of a sinking of a ship by the Germans. There was a lot of controversy over that. They didn't really want it in the media and so forth. So he had just a very quick time to come back and spend with the family. I think it was over Christmas, right, Dad? Yeah. And so that was really the only time that he came back. And so, he was about to head out in this photo here, and he didn't know how many years it was going to be before he could return home. Like many soldiers, right? He wasn't different in that regard. So.
And your grandmother, Grace, she was a remarkably strong woman. She bought the house for the family and did all that without him. Right. And that was hard to do in those days.
With the help of his brother Howard, she acquired a home, and he wrote in one of the letters, "We'll be sending back, I'll be sending back $400 a month so we can get that paid off." He said that's a very smart investment. I'm happy that Howard, his brother, would help her do that. But and in fact, his parents didn't even own a home. I learned from my dad, they just rented their whole lives. So he didn't come from a very wealthy background, but he knew enough to save and to really build for a future. So,
And you've got to tell us about your mom, Alice. She was a remarkable spouse also. Very strong woman.
Yes, she was. She was only 19 years old when she married my dad. They met quite by accident, but that's a long story, so I won't bore you with it. But from the first place when they were married that they had to move to, my father was appointed as Consul General to Chicago. And my grandmother had a fit because she thought, oh, that's entering Indian country, and it was not even safe. But my mother adjusted very well to the frequent changes and always kept busy doing something that was worthwhile. For instance, during the war, my mother and I retreated when the bombings started, the bombings in Tokyo where our home was, and we moved to our country house in a small mountain town, a resort which was founded by American missionaries. So it wasn't a typical resort town. There were golf courses, tennis courts, a church, but no gambling places or anything of that sort. And the residents of the town were probably less than 1,000 people. It was strictly a summer resort. And we were there, and of course my mother wasn't the type to just sit and do nothing. So she decided to speak to the residents of the town, discovered that many of the ladies who had babies were having trouble nursing them because of the poor diet that they were forced to be on. And so my mother decided that the kimono sleeve would make an ideal diaper to be used. And so I was sent to all the households in this little resort town to try to round up all the cotton kimonos, which weren't being used, so we could make diapers out of them. She also decided that goats were easy to keep, and goat milk should be healthy for the babies. She also realized that there was no medical facility at all in this little town. So she negotiated with a doctor in a nearby city to come on a monthly basis to form a clinic to look into the health needs of the people in the town. So anyway, she apparently did not mind the frequent moves and the adjustment to different cultures. One story I would like to tell about my mother is when we first went to Germany after our stay in Brussels. It was in 1939. We received a briefing that it would be possible that everything that went on in the embassy would be listened to by the Germans. That was a horrible experience at the age of 30 and practically a magpie who talked all the time. The notion that somebody else was going to hear everything that was going on was very traumatic for me. My mother had a secretary who was German but had spent many years in London, so she spoke English perfectly. And one time I was in my mother's office, and oddly enough, I cannot remember Frau, whatever her name was. But anyway, she came in, tears in her eyes, crying, because she had just received a summons from the Gestapo. And apparently, at the time, to be summoned to the Gestapo was the beginning of the end, possibly, of your life. And so my mother said to Frau, don't be concerned, I'll go with you, which she did. Of course, the Gestapo were just absolutely beyond words. They were so shocked they didn't expect an ambassador's wife to accompany somebody that they had. And so they had some lame excuse that, oh, it's not really important. We just wanted to know who she had worked for in London. But anyway, it was obvious that she would not be safe. So when we left Germany, my parents made sure that she was relocated to London so that she would not have to deal with the Gestapo again. But that was the sort of, my mother was, if there was a solution to some problem, she would take care of it. And she was remarkable in the sense that she adjusted so well to any adversity that happened to come our way.
What a great story. Well, I want to remind the audience, you're going to have the opportunity to ask a question or two. So be thinking. I'm going to throw one more question at you formally here, and then we hope that you'll step forward and indicate that you would like to ask a question. I would really like to know what you think, what should the history books say about Saburo Kurusu? And I'm going to ask the same of you, Brian, but how do the textbooks get it wrong today? What should they say?
Well, the end of my father's career was an attempt at negotiating peace in the United States. And unfortunately, the general opinion was once Pearl Harbor occurred, that he was really not trying to negotiate for peace, that it was all a smokescreen to enable Pearl Harbor to happen. And that was a tremendous source of sadness to him, to think that at the end of his career, general opinion was that it was for not really an effort to negotiate peace. And I remember after the war, when the war crimes trials were beginning, and the American judge who was named to head it was Judge Keenan. And of course, my dad was called to be interviewed by Judge Keenan to establish whether or not he could be considered a war criminal. Well, in this interview, Judge Keenan mentioned to my dad that one telegram that he had sent from Washington, D.C. to Tokyo indicated that he was fully aware of Pearl Harbor going to occur. And my dad looked at the supposed cable that Judge Keenan showed him, and he said, I certainly don't recall ever sending a cable of this that you're showing me. And so my father volunteered that he would go and get the original cable from the Foreign Service that he had sent, and would have the translation at the same time. And he met with Judge Keenan again and showed him the cable that he actually had sent and the translation thereof. And Judge Keenan said, you know, I did the same thing, and you're right. The translation was totally in error. So a thing like a translation, a difference in language, can have very difficult consequences. But anyway, as a result of proving that he had not sent that cable, he did not have to suffer as a prospective war criminal.
Well, that's good that that was acknowledged.
Yes.
It changed your family's life.
However, apparently, this little incident was not sufficient to totally eradicate the notion that he had really come to be a smokescreen to cover the Pearl Harbor incident. So his career really ended on a really side note. sad note.
And a lot of that was due to Cordell Hull, the Secretary of State, who was poisoned really against your father, I think,
Yes.
from cables from the early 1930s
Yes.
already, and did not give your father the benefit of the doubt. So that, and of course,
So I understand.
the victors write the history. Brian, tell us what you would like to see the textbook say about your grandfather.
Well, there's two things I'd like to say, and the first is, I think we'll probably never know what he really did. If even through the war, post-war, all the way up until he stopped working for the intelligence division, we really won't know the full story, the full length. But what we do know is the legacy that he created, right? And so, the programs like the Hauenstein Center for Presidential Studies, the Cook Leadership Academy, I believe that, he, throughout his life, he had this sort of crystal ball to really see where the future was going. And I believe that, and he believed, and he strongly believed this, that the greatest leaders will come out of this organization, the Cook Leadership Academy. And it's got all the right pieces. Here he is with Carter. He was, part of the founding of the Van Andel Institute and a major contributor to what has gone on there. But he had his hand in so many things that will probably change our lives for many years to come, and we don't have a clue as to what that is right now. It's amazing what he was able to accomplish in his lifetime. And I'd love to see maybe a book, and I know you've got lots of notes, Gleaves, but I'd love to see a book come out about his post-war. And he often told me that the book that he wrote, The Intelligence Was My Line, which really focused on his war years, he said the story really gets interesting after that. But that's what he left me with, right?
That's right.
One little thing I'd like to add is the incident of the Tripartite Pact. I think a great deal of the suspicion of my father's intent in negotiating in Washington, D.C. before World War II was the fact that he had been the signer to the Tripartite Pact. Actually, he was deadly against the pact. He didn't think it had any, but it was pushed by both the Germans, Italians, and Mr. Mazzoca, who happened to be the foreign minister at the time. He was the architect of the pact. But being the senior diplomat in Europe at the time, he was ordered to sign it, as I mentioned before. But he immediately resigned after signing that Tripartite Pact. And he was called back to work when the attempt at negotiating a peace with the United States occurred.
Well, history is frequently rewritten based on archives opening up, and let's hope that as we go along, the truth will out. I think it always does. It just takes time. I want to make sure we open it up now to the audience. Does somebody have a question out there that you'd like to put to Pia and Brian?
Yes, I'd really like to hear about what happened after Pearl Harbor for your dad. Did he stay in this country? Did he have to transit back to Japan? So what happened following that?
There was an exchange which took place. The American diplomats in Japan were put on a ship, and the Japanese diplomats in Washington, D.C. were put on another ship, and the two ships landed at the southern tip of Africa. And then the people changed ships and were returned to their own country. It was sort of interesting that there was a group in Japan of statesmen and various specialized people would get together surreptitiously to try to form some sort of a policy that might be taken after the defeat, and there was no question in anybody's mind that Japan was going to be defeated. And I remember that as cover for these meetings, I would sometimes accompany my father. The meetings were held primarily in private homes, different homes. And I was sometimes asked to accompany my father so that it appeared that we were just visiting some family somewhere. But he was very much involved in the attempt to design some sort of an equitable future after the defeat of Japan.
We have a question from Annette Kirk. In the back.
Thank you very much. What did your father think about General Douglas MacArthur and his time in Japan? Did he appreciate him? Would he see problems?
Well, I feel, correctly or otherwise, that the perfect person was chosen because the Japanese were not accustomed to officials who would be hail fellow well met type of people. And possibly, for instance, had General Eisenhower been sent as the Supreme Commander, he may not have commanded the respect that General MacArthur did. Japanese were used to his type of personality, and I think that was a great help. The other thing that General MacArthur did, which was probably very helpful in calming the waters of pre-war enemy-occupied country, was the fact that he insisted that the emperor position be maintained, even though apparently there were many theories that he should be removed as the Emperor of Japan. But General MacArthur wisely decided that was not necessary and did not do it.
Another question. Here, Carol.
I wonder if Brian would explain the map up here.
Yeah, no, that's great. I was planning to kind of close with that. So my mother asked me about the map here.
Keep you on task. That's
She
right.
says, where did that come from? Interesting story on this. So when my grandfather, towards the end of his life, he was down in his office at home, and he reached up on the shelf and he pulled down this cardboard tube, and he says, "Have a look at this." And I look at it, and I'm like, "Is this what I think it is?" And he said, and I said, "Is this from like the war room in London?" And the date on this, by the way, is June 1st, 1944. So we know what happened right after that, right? But I think what's fascinating about this, beyond the fact that it's all hand-drawn and so forth, is the fact that the intelligence that was required to put something like this together required enigma, it required agents on the ground, double agents, it required flyovers. I mean, the amount of information here is just amazing to know, that in order for them to attack Normandy, they really needed all this information. Otherwise, they would have been completely annihilated. So I encourage you to come up and take a look at it afterwards.
Yeah, it's a fascinating artifact. I'm
Yeah.
sure the Smithsonian and everybody at the Army War College are after it.
Yeah.
Okay, another question. Yep, Mary Beth Wardrop.
Would one of you, either Brian or yourself, tell about the story?
Okay.
Tell the story that Ralph used to tell all the time about being stopped by General Patton and how he had the card from Eisenhower.
Yeah, it's a great story. So he used to love to show this card after the war. He would pull it out and say, this is my pass. Nobody else had this because, he had full clearance to interrogate anybody, to go anywhere he wanted, and to do basically anything he wanted. And so he was moving through Patton's division, and he had the curtains drawn in his vehicle because he was intelligence. He didn't want people knowing his movements. And Patton saw this, and he sent somebody over to the vehicle immediately and said, that guy's got to, take those curtains off or, draw them back. And he just held his hand out with his pass, and on he went, and Patton stormed away. Great story. I love that one. That's probably my favorite story. Thank you, Mary Beth.
Well,
Yeah, that's
just,
a good one.
just a little follow-up to that. So I invited Ralph over one day to come watch the movie Patton, with the George C. Scott, because I wanted to see how Ralph would respond to all of these scenes. And about 10 minutes into the movie, he said, "It's just like that son of a bitch."
It's true.
Any other questions? Yes.
Yeah, 6 months after Pearl Harbor was the Battle of Midway. I just wonder where your family was at the time and just how your father reacted to that.
My father was still at Tokyo at our home there, but my mother and I were already up in the mountains. And all during the war, of course, these group of people who were of some consequence politically had access to interesting information that was not publicly available. But it was certainly a very consequential road to defeat after the Midway incident. I can't honestly tell you what my father's reaction might have been because I was not close to him at the time. We were up in the mountains and he was in Tokyo.
One more question. I think we had a question over Peter.
What information got to you in Tokyo, and what was the reaction among the people that you knew to the dropping of the bomb on Hiroshima?
That was one news that was immediately publicized in the papers, although the papers were, the media was pretty much controlled by the government. And the immediate result was a disbelief of what that single bomb could do. And of course, invariably, there were people who had relatives or friends or people who had been at Hiroshima when it happened. So the gravity of what it created became very widely known very quickly. And of course, it's very soon after that the emperor officially made the speech of what would you call it? Surrender to the Allies. But it was one thing that was immediately, the information was dispersed in all the newsreels and news radio shows and everything. So the gravity of what had happened was immediately obvious, I think, to the entire population in Japan.
Well, I want to thank both of you for bringing your father, your grandfather out of the printed page of the history books and really putting flesh and bone on them and telling us who they were like as people, how they struggled, how they triumphed, and all the ways that they were interesting people, worthy of study and worthy of the students in our Cook Leadership Academy to study. These are Exhibit A and B of what leaders have to go through and how tough it is to be a leader. Ladies and gentlemen, please congratulate, thank you.
Thank you. I thank you all for listening. It's been quite a number of years since I tried to live just a Jane Doe wife. It's been quite an interesting experience for me, and I hope I imparted some information that you may not have had. Thank you for listening.
Good.